She was a woman, a wife, a mother of 6 children. She was a propagandist for the Allies.
Alle die ihren Palle da waren, die Mädchen noch die Jungen, die da geschafft haben, die hätten alle gerne hier Leben gegeben für die Grande Duchesse. Wir waren zu viel Paff, dass wir allein da standen.
She left in the middle of the night. And yes, there was a feeling that she should have stayed and experienced with them, just as the captain would go down with his ship.
When she said, "You will be liberated, I am suffering with you, but you will be liberated," we believed her very, very deeply.
Roosevelt had a weakness for European sovereigns, and the Grand Duchess played all the cards she could use in the interest of the country.
It's a neglected part of history. I think the Grand Duchess's role and her quite extraordinary leadership of her country in a government in exile is a story that has not been told.
Een land wie ons, dat nog nie engem ebbes te leed
The happiest country in the world cannot and must not go under.
In the spring of 1940, the tiny Duchy of Luxembourg was facing its darkest hour. Troops of Hitler's Third Reich were poised to invade. Luxembourg's head of state, Grand Duchess Charlotte, and her family prepared to flee the country. A German invasion was something the Luxembourg government had feared. Now the nightmare was on their doorstep.
Mein Pap ass alertéiert ginn ass gewoer ginn durch den Herr Dupont selber. Huet telefonéiert krit an der Nøcht, dat se lo sicher dat ze kommen, op der Grenz das Chlor, also mir gi fort.
Education Minister Nicholas Marg was one of the 5 Luxembourg ministers now trying to escape the Nazi advance. Also on the road that morning were Foreign Minister Joseph Besch, the government's 2 socialist members, Victor Bodson and Pierre Krier, and the Prime Minister, Pierre Dupont. All 5 were now heading west with their families, determined to evade the enemy troops.
Das nur lange überlegen, dat wir uns zu dem Schritt entschlossen, von ich fortzugehen. Es war schweren, mir ein notwendiger Schritt.
The Grand Duchess, after consultations with the ministers of her government, decided to go to the French border to await developments and only left Luxembourg soil when German mechanized troops were dangerously close. The Grand Ducal children also reached France, but had a narrow escape when the road was blocked by German machine gunners and their car had to be driven straight through them.
As Luxembourg celebrated 100 years of independence in 1939, the people saw in their Grand Duchess a living symbol. Charlotte was the embodiment of what it meant to be a Luxembourger.
Everybody was patriotic, everybody had flags, and we were all very fond of our Grand Duchess. She had this special aura around her, an absolute grande dame. You don't have many of them anymore.
Her charisma and charm equipped Charlotte well to be Grand Duchess. Although growing up alongside her elder sister, Mary Adelaide, she had never expected to be ruler. All that changed in 1919. Mary Adelaide's controversial reign was brought to an abrupt end after decisions taken during the First World War had put Luxembourg's very existence in doubt.
During World War I and a German military occupation, the government and the Grand Duchess Marie Adelaide had stayed in Luxembourg, believing what the Germans had said, that they would not interfere with Luxembourg politics.
The German Kaiser visited Luxembourg and she received him. Well, really, what could she do? I don't know how she could have said, "You can't walk into my palace," as the Germans were all over Luxembourg anyway. So that was badly received.
This had brought a monarchical crisis and even an existential crisis for the country, because she was accused of having been pro-German, which intentionally she certainly was not.
Prime Minister Reuter found he could save the dynasty and the independence of the country by exchanging the Grand Duchess. So he, after a lot of discussions, managed to have Grand Duchess Marie Adelaide resign, and her sister Charlotte then became the Grand Duchess in 1919.
Charlotte also became the people's choice. In the referendum held that year, Luxembourgers voted overwhelmingly to keep their constitutional monarch.
Sie war die jung neue Großherzorin, die an der schwierigen Situation das Land gefeiert hat. Das hat sie fertiggebracht durch ihre Persönlichkeit, durch ihre Manier, durch ihr Wesen, durch ihre Ruhe.
Luxembourg had come close to extinction after the Great War, explaining why patriotic fervour so gripped the nation as it celebrated its independence a generation later. But the people were also sending a clear message to their previous aggressors. In the words of their national motto, "We want to remain what we are." And they had good reason to worry about the true intentions of a revitalized and rearmed Germany.
We saw and heard, particularly by radio, the way Germany was going after 1933 with Hitler. And most of us were very clear-sighted about this, that everybody thought that this can only lead to a war. And the Germans made no secret of it, that they wanted Luxembourg, as they put it, return into the bosom of the German motherland. The atmosphere became more and more strained because we could even see from our shores war preparations made by the Germans.
Luxembourg's government faced a terrible dilemma: just how to safeguard the nation in the face of a second German invasion, now seemingly inevitable.
This time one felt correctly that with Hitler at the head of Germany, history would not repeat itself in the same way.
They had drawn the lesson of the negative experience of her sister staying and being exposed to the German occupant. And the German occupants in 1914, 1918 were nice compared to what the Nazis would do.
I think there was no big discussion. This time, they would not stay in Luxembourg. They would not enter into contact with the Germans. They would do everything the other way round.
The mad dog is on the march again. He brings all the horrors of total warfare to three of the fairest and cleanest of neutrals in Western Europe. Pity the peoples of these nations.
On the dawn of May 10, 1940, the formidable German war machine let loose its hordes on tiny, unarmed Luxembourg.
At about 4 o'clock, I heard the noise of airplanes becoming stronger and stronger. I see squadrons of German aircraft flying low so that I could identify them very easily and coming from Germany. And I said to myself, this is it.
Eng Kolonne der Ahnete iwwer Leibrekte Robberfirre, dat war onheimlich wat Dingen durchkommen sinn, engen Dingen anderen.
People were utterly at loss. They didn't know what was going to come now. Of course, the first reaction was then, as they could not accuse the French, they of course accused their own government and even the Grand Duchess that they hadn't taken the right decision.
The people left behind, they considered that they had been abandoned by the Grand Duchess and the government, and they suspected that the ministers were responsible, that they took the Grand Duchess along nearly by force.
This decision entailed an immediate and heartbreaking sacrifice. It meant temporarily leaving my country in the hour of its greatest need and separating myself from my people, to whom I was united by a deep and lasting affection. No other course was open.
For those Luxembourg ministers who did get away, a perilous journey still lay ahead.
We crossed France, we went to Paris, where the government stayed and tried to organize whatever could be organized. We felt somewhat despondent. We didn't expect things to happen that way. We had hoped that the French could turn around and drive them out, but they did not. There was absolutely no chance.
On the 10th of June, the government was told that they had to leave Paris and go to southern France. So they joined the Grand Duchess in a chateau nearby.
We were with those huge columns of people fleeing on the roads. And the Germans, they were, with the planes, they were attacking those people.
On the 18th, they were told that they had to leave France, that the French government could not guarantee their safety in France. So they decided to go to Portugal.
6 weeks after the German invasion of Luxembourg, Charlotte and the 4 of her government ministers who'd managed to escape found themselves in a foreign country with no immediate prospect of return. Their situation looked bleak.
Once the French were down in defeat, you had to make an act of faith to be sure that the British would win and that the United States would come out, because if the German army was victorious, they had finished the French off in 6 weeks. So in this sense, there was a long period of uncertainty.
Prince Felix, her husband, he was, if you like, a very staunch partisan of joining the Allies.
He hated the Nazis and what they represented. For him, there was no question that any deal could be made, that she should under no circumstances go back.
President Roosevelt met Prince Felix in 1939, as well as Prince John, when they went to New York for the International Fair, and he had offered the 3 royal families of the Netherlands, of Belgium, and of Luxembourg to have the children in the United States in case of war in Europe.
Roosevelt proposed to bring the whole family from Lisbon on a special warship, the Trenton it was called.
He ordered the Trenton to go back to Lisbon and take the Grand Ducal children to the United States. They knew that this American connection was important, that this counted and this will play a role. So they could not disregard the American president's offer, and Prince Felix with the children would go on board and leave for the US.
A reluctant Charlotte knew it was the right decision. Her family would be safer across the Atlantic. She was now under pressure from another quarter. What was left of Luxembourg's administration at home and the people themselves were demanding her return.
A letter came from Mr. Reuter, who was the president of the Chamber of Deputies, and Mr. Vera was the president of the Administrative Committee here in Luxembourg. They implored the Grand Duchess that she should come back. If she would not come back, then no chance for our independence. And they even violently accused the ministers for being responsible for having put the country into this position.
She said the famous word, "Mon cœur dit oui, ma tête dit non." My heart says yes, to go back to Luxembourg? My brain says no.
The future course of Luxembourg now hung in the balance. The ministers were split on what to do. And then came a further surprise intervention, causing Charlotte to waver at the 11th hour.
Then came the influence of American diplomats, Caddehy from Brussels and Phillips from Rome. And these two American ambassadors said, you should do what your heart tells you. You should go back. They urged her so strongly that after dinner she was in tears, coming back and saying, I will go back. And the ministers were appalled. Everybody was taken aback when she came back from this dinner. They said, what are we doing now?
Unaware of the unfolding drama in Portugal, Felix and the Grand Ducal children arrive in the United States.
I highly appreciate the kind invitation from the United States and the President to my children to come over to the States. We are very thankful to both the President and the government, and we are especially pleased that we are discussing on your splendid ship, and we enjoyed it very much. I have no political statements to give to you.
Charlotte's husband remained diplomatically silent in front of his American hosts. But his private fears over Germany's intentions for Luxembourg were soon confirmed.
In der Stadt Luxemburg fand die erste nationalsozialistische Großkundgebung statt. Gauleiter Simon, der Chef der Zivilverwaltung.
What clinched the final decision was what the Germans were doing in Luxembourg. The Germans had exchanged the military administration by a civilian administration with a Gauleiter. This meant that the Nazi was now taking over. One of the first things he did was to abolish Luxembourg as official language, to declare German the official language, to have a huge parade. And then the diplomats said, can you imagine what would have happened if you had been around? You would have been forced to participate in all this. You would have totally compromised yourself. And so they decided, now that was it.
Whatever the rights and wrongs, the decision had been made. There was no going back.
Besch convinced her that the moment had come for her to go to Britain. The Grand Duchess wanted to go to a country which was at war, and with that she would signify on which side her whole family stood. Once over there, he got his contacts with Eden, whom he knew very well, and it was decided that the Grand Duchess should follow him a few days later.
Charlotte arrived in London to find the country itself fighting for survival. In the skies over England, the Battle of Britain was raging, and Hitler's Luftwaffe was about to begin its nightly pounding of the capital.
The Grand Duchess arrived on a Saturday morning in Victoria Station. So a record was then made, but there were too many noises. It wasn't a very good record. And so my husband said, we can remake this record. He took the Grand Duchess to the BBC in the middle of the night, and they had a record of the station noises, but not too loud, so she could make a very good recording, which was then given the next morning, Sunday morning.
Besch contacted the BBC, suggesting that Charlotte should record a series of speeches to be broadcast from London to boost morale in Luxembourg.
We didn't appreciate then just how vital news and information was to people in a beleaguered state who are looking for hope to grasp at, until we started getting the responses. And then there was no question. There were letters that would come from anonymous listeners writing in to say how much they cherished what they could hear coming from the BBC. Once you saw those, there was no doubt of the power of what you were doing.
I think for the speech of September 1940, if you look at the documents, at the drafts that are still there, it's the handwriting of Joseph Besch. The Grand Duchess had not held many speeches before. She was not really used to and trained to have these speeches made.
Leif Letzeburger. Das soll kein politisch Urspruch sein. Nehmen Gruß und ich
are forced to live under foreign oppression. A greeting from the bottom of my heart. I am happy and grateful that I can finally speak to you.
Nobody knew that the BBC would broadcast this speech. Nobody knew that on September 5th, the Grand Duchess would make this speech. So, as with the speech of General de Gaulle on June the 18th, that nobody really knew, but some heard it nevertheless. And by spreading the news, the speech reached a majority of adult Luxembourgers.
It was after much thought that we made the decision and took the steps to leave you. It was a difficult but necessary step. And despite knowing that more than one Luxembourger didn't agree with it, and despite the enemy using my absence in every possible way, that step was not in vain. More than ever, we want to remain what we were, a free and independent Luxembourg.
It was very important that finally there was a message, and it was a message that said, we are here, we are working for you, we are thinking of you, we have not forgotten you, and we left the country to work for you for your independence.
Radio, dat nimmen dürfen geluisterd kind op verschiedene Duitse stationen. Dat andere war alles verboden.
Ich meng het Leiit hunn drop gegamst. Wenig as Sunday, wenig as Sondig. Wir hunn iwwer ormal heieren, a ganz gené heieren van den Toon gangen as dot 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 dom, dot 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 dom.
BBC calling. We are putting over to you a recording.
Ich se ger heier schwätzen. Was jo net wat op der Beskiftingen, awer de Leiit awer trotz allem die puer Deechkanten huet dawer Fréet gemerk Courage awer.
Dat war natürlich een groot evenement alkeier wann Grand Duchess geschwaart huet. Dat war ganz émouvant. Het huet gespuert dat Grand Duchess selber och ému war, dat ze ook ganz graf war, want ze geschwaart huet.
Die van de Gestapo, van de SS, die collaborateuren, die overal luisteren gegangen zijn op een wilt Nederlander luisteren, een vreemde radio luisteren.
Despite the penalties that were on listening to the BBC, and they went too far, they went even up to death. Listen to the BBC and listen to the Grand Duchess. This had a tremendous impact.
Our heaviest burden is that we all cannot be at home to share your sufferings with you, but both you and we are certain of the final outcome. And I can only repeat that there is not the slightest doubt of your final liberation.
Whilst reaching out to occupied Luxembourgers through her BBC broadcasts, Charlotte herself felt the pain of separation in poignant private messages from her family, now exiled in the United States.
C'est moi, Félix, qui parle. Enfant et moi vous embrassons tendrement dans l'espoir de vous avoir bientôt ici.
Hij is het wonderschön. Ik vind zeer abierend te gezien. Tegen deze gobierenheid.
Gestern haben wir Picknick gemacht und wir müssen die Krieger See runter. Und dann der Kanu wird gekniet auf dem Reck zum anderen See durch. Lieb, Mama, hoffentlich für immer uns geschenkt. Viel Geld mit Großma und alle zu Brüder.
Hoffentlich verschwindet der Sekträ geschwind aus unserem Land, aus unserer Erde. Viel Geld für bekannt wird. Wir denken immer, nee, die umarmen Jean.
Europe looked across the Atlantic for help. But Americans had little appetite to get involved in someone else's war.
Another war, not for me. This time America should keep out, and I know I will.
I haven't the slightest idea of European affairs.
Let Europe fight their own battles. They mean nothing to us.
As early as 1937-38, FDR's trying very hard to make the American people aware of the threat, because for him, he could see that if the British went under, that would leave America alone.
Roosevelt had problems of his own. The Germans were working fantastically to keep America out of the war.
Into this free debate trooped the agents of the aggressors. They wore Hitler's uniforms, but they wrapped themselves in the American flag. For Hitler had said America could be conquered from within and fall as an overripe plum to the Nazi master race.
President Roosevelt certainly wanted to convince American senators and people, and he certainly had the feeling that a person like Charlotte was ideal to communicate that cause to them.
Luxembourg's Washington ambassador, Hugh Le Gallais, seemed to sense this window of opportunity in a letter to his prime minister.
There is a passage here which is very interesting. Le Gallais says the following. He said, "We need to win the war, but we have no army, we have no colony, we have no weapons, except that of propaganda, which resides entirely in the personality of Her Royal Majesty the Grand Duchess. As the only sovereign in this hemisphere," he says, "Her Royal Highness can occupy a unique position in the combat against the Nazis."
Crossing the Atlantic gave Charlotte a unique opportunity to win American support for the Allies' cause and bring her closer to her family, for a while at least. She was committed to seeing Luxembourg set free. Traveling across the United States kept the Grand Duchess in the public eye, and it had the desired effect. Her charm and easy manner won her friends at the highest levels.
Roosevelt saw this lady. She was beautiful, she was intelligent, she was well educated, she was a princess throughout.
Roosevelt, like everybody else, fell under her charm, and he said to her, "My child, don't worry, I'll give you back your country."
Somehow, I don't know what made it click, I don't know, but when she came to President Roosevelt, immediately, I mean, he called her my child. I mean, he was much older than she was.
He had a soft spot for her.
He had a soft spot, absolutely. And that was a great help to us.
In asking the Grand Duchess to journey through the United States to counter German Nazi propaganda, he found his counterpart. In common vernacular, she was a propagandist for the Allies.
When the Grand Duchess first came to the United States, she basically came with her family in a refugee status, even though they were given a 21-gun salute, etc. But they were refugees. I think FDR felt the American people need to know about this. And this is the way Hitler functions. And he used the Grand Duchess to express it.
This gives me the great pleasure of standing before the microphone and speaking to the American public, especially to their women, about the fate which befell my country in this war.
Once you explained what happened, people became aware not only of what happened to Luxembourg, but of the danger the Hitler Germany represented. That is something that many Americans did not know.
If Americans were still skeptical of the threat posed to them as the world gradually slid into war, the events of the 7th of December 1941 dispelled any such doubts. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by Japanese forces propelled the US into the conflict.
with confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
Charlotte's exile began to take on a more purposeful role, encouraging sympathy for the Allies, giving news and hope to those back home, and encouraging Luxembourg's resistance fighters.
According to all reports transmitted by underground sources from Luxembourg, the devotion and love of the people for their sovereign is ever increasing. She has become the symbol of their resistance to all attempts to Germanize the country and the symbol of their confidence and hope in the future when Luxembourg will again be free and independent.
No one could have known at the time how long it would take to win back Luxembourg's freedom, or the terrible price that would be paid as the Nazi rulers found new ways of suppressing the population.
Gauleiter Simon declared that all the Luxembourgers born between 1920 and 1925 or 26 will do German services. That means going to the working camps, labor camps, and also being enrolled in the German army.
The young men and young women too were forced to be conscripted. They had to wear the uniform, and now they even looked totally like a German soldier.
How degrading for a young Luxembourg patriot to have to wear the uniform of the mortal enemy of his liberty. What a heartbreaking experience for the mothers of Luxembourg to see their sons torn from them and sacrificed to the demon of hate and oppression symbolized by the swastika.
If you did not go, if, for instance, you deserted or you were hiding away, you risked that your family would be attacked. So it was a very, very concrete decision. If I try to run away from the German army, my family will be forced to suffer the consequences, and that was a very tragic dilemma.
A dilemma that Charlotte addressed directly in a heartfelt plea to the young conscripts.
Lützeburger Jungen, wann sie ihr wegschläfen, für gehend ihr Frit zu kämpfen, da vergierst nie, dat da Lützeburger sit, erwart ihr hemicht von ihr erwart.
I think that speech is the most important she made, showing that she understood the dilemma. She just said, okay, if you decide to wear this uniform, be aware that we know that you were forced.
Wann sie ich zwingen, ein Eed zu schwieren, dat as kein Eed. Ert Herz muss sich frei halen von dem, was sie ihr Lübsen schwieren tun. Mat Soldaten, die nimmen ob den Tag lauren, wo Tyrannei vom Hitler zerbrach geht, gewannen Preise ke Krieg.
You have families who had 4, 5 sons forced into the German army, and having the moral authority of the Grand Duchess telling them that she understood why they had taken this or that decision, I think was very, very helpful.
Tonight, We the People presents the head of a European country, a tiny country which last week started another spark that may spread all over Europe. We the People are honored to present the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Pierre Dupont.
4 days ago, I learned that the workers in one steel mill openly went on strike. And then, for the first time in any nation under German rule, the strike spread all over the country.
But this movement was brutally drowned in the blood of the supposed leaders of the resistance. These latter were summarily judged and immediately executed.
That had a tremendous impact on public opinion in Britain and in the States. Churchill made a declaration, Eden made a press statement. There suddenly was an awakening to the fact that something important and bloody and atrocious had happened to this small, innocent country.
The resistance, the strike and so on, were of course also part of this propaganda in the States. So the Grand Duchess in her speeches could focus on the resistance in Luxembourg. They had evidence to say, well, we exist as an independent country and we are on the good side.
She came to Chicago because of the massive community of Luxembourgers that had emigrated to this area. They were very fortunate because they were flower growers, and they settled in an area that today is Gold Coast land.
The Leiders were one such family, running a prosperous flower-growing business in Buffalo Grove, south of Chicago. For Jim Leider, though just a boy at the time, the Grand Duchess's visit left an indelible imprint on his family history.
My grandfather and my dad were well regarded in the Luxembourg community. My father went with Prince John throughout the Midwest raising funds and going to little towns like Luxembourg, Iowa, to rally support for the cause. They went to these different towns, visited with the different members of the Luxembourg community, and people who even were just friends of Luxembourgers would come out in support of it, turning out with American flags and Luxembourg flags. Well, the Grand Duchess and Prince Jean and a large entourage of the Luxembourg family and political people had come through the greenhouses, and they were doing a tour. You can tell from the films that we have of her talking to my father and real sincere interest in what he was doing and what they were trying to do. I think it just kind of exudes through the film. You can kind of see it for yourself, what a warm personality she had.
Whether meeting a family or addressing a crowd of thousands, the effect was the same.
She was a tremendous success. She went to the studios in Hollywood, for example.
They met with L.B. Mayer, the head of the studio. They met famous actors who were shooting that day, such as Spencer Tracy, Greer Garson, Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, Walter Pidgeon, and so on. It's very difficult to measure the result of such propaganda activities. But there is an interesting example. If you take the While We Fight series, in the first film of the series, Luxembourg is not even mentioned. In While We Fight #3, that came out in 1943, there Luxembourg is mentioned, and you also have a map where you can see the borders of Luxembourg.
Between Britain and Germany stood not only France, but the
So Luxembourg was literally put on the map. And I think that this could have been the result of the propaganda efforts of the Luxembourg government and the Grand Duchess in the United States at that time.
The President is likewise our great friend and protector. The President and leading men in the States are fully aware of what is going on at home, how you are made to suffer and how you resist.
In the same way, FDR had a friendship with Winston Churchill. It seems to me that he had a friendship with the Grand Duchess as well. The relationship with FDR started off more slowly, but as you look at the correspondence towards the end of the time, 43, 44, it becomes far more familiar, far more with FDR writing a full page of advice and comment and glad to hear about this and somebody lost their job and so forth. He enjoyed talking with her. What I think it indicated was a respect and liking, a friendship that was quite beyond two heads of state relating to each other.
Roosevelt's friendship added weight to Charlotte's propaganda war, whilst her son, Prince Jean, continued to make his own contribution to winning back freedom for his country. He joined the British Army as part of the Irish Guards, the traditional regiment of his old school, Ampleforth. While Luxembourg's government in exile stayed in central London, Charlotte moved her family to Byfleet, a small town in the suburbs of the capital. It was hardly normal family life. The business of winning back freedom for the country was still a priority.
Luxembourg had more than her share in this war's sufferings. Small in number, but great in spirit, our people at home and our boys on free soil strive with the Allied forces for a better world. Our resources, far from negligible, will all be mobilized with those of our great allies to safeguard peace once victory is won. Luxembourg, one of the world's big steel producers, also produced 300,000 people with an iron will never to be German.
By the spring of 1944, Allied preparations to retake Europe were well advanced. Some Luxembourg patriots who'd escaped the Nazis and made their way to England were now part of the Luxembourg battery and itching to prove their loyalty to the throne.
De nämlichste Geest herrscht unter den Lexicburger Freiwilligen, die nur allmählich Aventuren de Weh nur England fandten. Es sind lauter kehrgesandt German, Lexicburger durch und durch. Met Leib als Seel, en is de stolz op ze. Wanneer ze door die Römer stoen hun, met een Lexicburger Aufzeichen op ihre Uniform.
The Allies' time to hit back at the enemy came in June that year with the Normandy landings. 5 days into the campaign, Prince Jean and comrades within the Guards' Armoured Division crossed the English Channel, landing on the French coast near Bayeux. It was the start of the long push through Europe for Jean, one amongst hundreds of thousands of Allied troops. The Allied operation to liberate Europe was underway. Slowly but surely, American and British troops were gaining the upper hand and being greeted like heroes by a grateful population.
Roosevelt had promised the Grand Duchess that she would be returning to her country real soon. And we were told we have to take Luxembourg, it's a must.
American troops of the US 5th Armored Division crossed the border into Luxembourg, joined by Prince Jean and Prince Felix. They arrived in the city to an ecstatic welcome.
De Wezerer gaan ze dan de pannen. Hij ben maar toch zoveel leid vond dir. Zoveel leid. En toen zijn ze maar rauskijken, maar geguckt. Of op de balkon, die hebben ze opgemaakt. Toen guckte ich, dass da auch Amerikaner und Engländer standen. Und da waren eine Uniformen drin. Und ich wusste nicht, dass das der Prinz Felix wäre.
I don't think there was a soul in a house or an apartment in Luxembourg because everybody was out in the street to greet us. It was crowded. You couldn't move. I was wondering how they could walk because the people were bunched up on them. They must have picked every flower in Luxembourg they could find to give to everybody, giving them to the prince.
Wir hatten an der Schlosshecke, da hatten wir so ein großes Bild vom Hitler stehen. Und ich habe mein Leder von der Seite abgeklommen, bis dann den Namen geholt. Und ich trappe drauf, dass die Bild trappe drauf, und dann auf der Balkon. Leute haben sich alle weggezogen. Und ich habe gerufen, macht Platz, noch könnte. Und ich habe bis zum Hitler geholt. Und ich habe gerufen, über den Balkon hoch auf die Straße gehalten. Da stecken, ich komme nach Fatzen in den Null.
People had a quite new experience because they touched members of the Grand Ducal family. You see Prince Felix and Prince John being carried. Before, it was the symbolic image of the mother protecting the country. And now it's a military liberation, so you send the males and they are wearing uniforms. And this time it was the uniform everyone was waiting for. They were fighting symbolically for the liberation. Having members of the Grand Ducal family in Luxembourg the day of liberation meant that Luxembourg was free.
As the Germans were driven back by the Allied offensive, Luxembourgers could not have guessed that the worst was yet to come.
when they rolled into Luxembourg. France had been liberated, and they were on their way to Berlin. Nothing would stop them. Well, the German army did stop them, and it's what we call the Battle of the Bulge.
It was to be one of the bloodiest episodes of the war. American forces were overstretched and overconfident. German commanders took advantage of the appalling weather conditions to launch a massive counterattack. It was a devastating blow for Allied morale.
I had just come home from military school with Christmas vacation. Christmas in the White House with my grandparents. And the Battle of the Bulge hit us all, hit every American, really, because we were so used to victory. Seeing this cemetery brings it all back.
The battle lasted a little over a month. With close to 20,000 American troops killed, 70,000 more were left injured. Most of northern Luxembourg was destroyed.
After the Battle of the Bulge, when the Americans entered more and more deeply into Germany, and the British in the north and the Russians in the east, the people here didn't understand why she was not allowed to come back.
At that time, FDR wrote urging her not to return because she was ready to go. And he urged her not to return to Luxembourg until, as he puts it, if I remember the letter, the Huns are pushed beyond the Rhine.
She had to wait until April 14th, 1945, less than a month before Germany surrendered.
I speak to you to say farewell. 5 years ago, I left my country, overrun by the Germans, to defend in the free world its right to independence. To me, you are now giving, in the words of the poet, gentle path to go home, home to my beloved country.
At 4:30 this afternoon, the Grand Duchess landed on the Luxembourg airfield. Our correspondent, herself a Luxembourger, was present at this scene and during the procession through the city.
When the Grand Duchess set foot for the first time in nearly 5 years on the soil of her country, she was visibly struggling with emotion. I was the only woman amongst those welcoming the Grand Duchess on the airfield, and the Grand Duchess came over to me and grasped my hand. And so I was one of the first citizens of Luxembourg to tell her how happy we are to have her with us again.
It's a day as Luxembourg had not known before. And I'm not much given to drinking, but I was drunk. And I was not the only one.
She went into the palace, then showed herself on the balcony, and then it was frenzy. I can say it was the most intense moment of our history.
Det moment, das war ein Moment, das kann ich einem sagen, das vergesse ich nie. Wie in so einem richtig Lebensstand, aber wie sie den ewig gesehen auf 100 Stunden. Das war ein Moment, ich kann nicht schildern, ich weiß es nicht mehr. Leben hart gekrascht, wie gelernt. Ja.
After 5 years of enemy occupation, Luxembourg was free. Its Grand Duchess was home. Despite the chaos and confusion as hostilities ceased, those who'd survived could again openly proclaim their motto: "We want to remain what we are, Luxembourgers." For Charlotte, the moment was tempered by the loss of her friend, mentor, and liberator. Franklin D. Roosevelt had died the previous day.
May I be allowed, with a poignant sense of personal grief, here to pay tribute to their great leader, your staunch friend and ours, President Roosevelt, whose death in the hour of triumph is an irreplaceable loss for mankind.
She toured the country and she went practically everywhere. Even in the ruins of the northern part, she was widely acclaimed and nobody held her responsible for anything. She was just beyond any reproach and any criticism.
The position of the Grand Ducal family and of monarchy in Luxembourg was cemented after it. With the return of Grand Duchess Charlotte, liberation had come to its fulfillment.
Dat war für mich wie für die allermeeste Lützeburger eng Rettung vom Land, an eng Bestätigung, dat Lützeburg eng Existenzberechtigung huet, net an de Symbol davon als Grand Duchess.
I'm convinced that had the Grand Duchess stayed in Luxembourg, Luxembourg would either no longer be an independent country now or no longer a monarchy.
In the spring of 1940, the tiny Duchy of Luxembourg was facing its darkest hour. Troops of Hitler's Third Reich were poised to invade. Luxembourg's head of state, Grand Duchess Charlotte, and her family prepared to flee the country. A German invasion was something the Luxembourg government had feared. Now the nightmare was on their doorstep.
Mein Pap ass alertéiert ginn ass gewuer ginn duerch den Herr Dupont selwer, huet telefonéiert krit an der Nøcht, dat se lo sicher dat ze kommen, op der Grenz das Klor, also mir gi fort.
Education Minister Nicholas Marg was one of the 5 Luxembourg ministers now trying to escape the Nazi advance. Also on the road that morning were Foreign Minister Joseph Besch, the government's 2 socialist members, Victor Bodson and Pierre Krier, and the Prime Minister, Pierre Dupont. All 5 were now heading west with their families, determined to evade the enemy troops.
Das nun lange Überlegung, dat mir uns zu dem Schritt entschlossen, von ich fortzugehen. Es war schweren, mir ein notwendiger Schritt.
The Grand Duchess, after consultations with the ministers of her government, decided to go to the French border to await developments and only left Luxembourg soil when German mechanized troops were dangerously close. The Grand Ducal children also reached France, but had a narrow escape when the road was blocked by German machine gunners and their car had to be driven straight through them.
As Luxembourg celebrated 100 years of independence in 1939, the people saw in their Grand Duchess a living symbol. Charlotte was the embodiment of what it meant to be a Luxembourger.
Everybody was patriotic, everybody had flags, and
We were all very fond of our Grand Duchess. She had this special aura around her, an absolute grande dame. You don't have many of them anymore.
Her charisma and charm equipped Charlotte well to be Grand Duchess, although growing up alongside her elder sister, Mary Adelaide, she had never expected to be ruler. All that changed in 1919. Mary Adelaide's controversial reign was brought to an abrupt end after decisions taken during the First World War had put Luxembourg's very existence in doubt.
During World War I and a German military occupation, the government and the Grand Duchess Mary Adelaide had stayed in Luxembourg, believing what the Germans had said, that they would not interfere with Luxembourg politics.
The German Kaiser visited Luxembourg and she received him. Well, really, what could she do? I don't know how she could have said, "You can't walk into my palace," as the Germans were all over Luxembourg anyway. So that was badly received.
This had brought a monarchical crisis and even an existential crisis for the country, because she was accused of having been pro-German, which intentionally she certainly was not.
Prime Minister Reuter found he could save the dynasty and the independence of the country by exchanging the Grand Duchess. So he, after a lot of discussions, managed to have Grand Duchess Marie Adelaide resign, and her sister Charlotte then became the Grand Duchess in 1919.
Charlotte also became the people's choice. In the referendum held that year, Luxembourgers voted overwhelmingly to keep their constitutional monarch.
Sie war die jung neue Großherzorin, die an der schwierigen Situation das Land gefeiert hat. Das hat sie fertiggebracht durch ihre Persönlichkeit, durch ihre Manier, durch ihr Wesen, durch ihre Ruhe.
Luxembourg had come close to extinction after the Great War, explaining why patriotic fervour so gripped the nation as it celebrated its independence a generation later. But the people were also sending a clear message to their previous aggressors. In the words of their national motto, "We want..."
She was a woman, a wife, a mother of 6 children. She was a propagandist for the Allies.
Alle Leute, die am Palais da waren, die Mädels ja noch, die Jungen, die da geschafft haben, die hätten alle Leute hier Leben gegeben für die Grande Duchesse. Wir waren so viel Pop, dass wir allein da standen.
She left in the middle of the night. And yes, there was a feeling that she should have stayed and experienced with them, just as the captain would go down with his ship.
When she said, "You will be liberated, I am suffering with you, but you will be liberated," we believed her very, very deeply.
Roosevelt had a weakness for European sovereigns, and the Grand Duchess played all the cards she could use in the interest of the country.
It's a neglected part of history. I think the Grand Duchess's role and her quite extraordinary leadership of her country in a government in exile is a story that has not been told.
Ein Land wie uns, das nach nie engem etwas zu leben
The happiest country in the world cannot and must not go under.
To remain what we are. And they had good reason to worry about the true intentions of a revitalized and rearmed Germany.
We saw and heard, particularly by radio, the way Germany was going after 1933 with Hitler, And most of us were very clear-sighted about this, that everybody thought that this can only lead to a war. And the Germans made no secret of it, that they wanted Luxembourg, as they put it, return into the bosom of the German motherland. The atmosphere became more and more strained because we could even see from our shores war preparations made by the Germans.
Luxembourg's government faced a terrible dilemma: just how to safeguard the nation in the face of a second German invasion, now seemingly inevitable.
This time one felt correctly that with Hitler at the head of Germany, history would not repeat itself in the same way.
They had drawn the lesson of the negative experience of her sister staying and being exposed to the German occupant. And the German occupants in 1914, 1918 were nice compared to what the Nazis would do.
I think there was no big discussion